Tom Grayson stood in the middle of his farm, hands on his hips, staring at the horizon. His crops, a sea of golden wheat, should have been thriving. They had been his pride for years, passed down through generations. But today, something felt off. The air had a heaviness to it, a strange quiet that only comes when things are wrong. Tom wiped the sweat from his brow and looked toward the irrigation pumps. Normally, the sound of water rushing through the pipes was a constant companion, an assurance that life would continue to grow, that the land would feed him, his family, and the community. But today, the usual hum was missing. Instead, there was silence, and that silence gnawed at his insides. He walked toward the pump station, his boots kicking up dust with each step. The station sat on the edge of his land, just far enough from the fields to seem isolated. Tom had spent countless hours here, ensuring everything was running smoothly. But as he reached the station, he saw it. The pump was off. It was strange. There was no reason for it to be shut down. The pipes were intact. The equipment was fine. Yet the water wasn't flowing. With a sinking feeling, Tom dialed the number of the city office. The phone rang for what felt like an eternity before someone finally picked up. It was an official, his voice flat and uninterested. "Mr. Grayson, I'm sorry, but due to new city regulations, we've had to redirect water resources to urban areas. Your water supply is suspended until further notice." Tom felt his breath catch in his chest. "What do you mean, suspended?" he asked, his voice rising despite his best efforts to stay calm. "The city has prioritized water use for residential areas," the official explained, his tone matter of fact. "We're facing a drought, and the city needs it more than you do right now. You'll have to make do with what you've got." Tom could hardly believe what he was hearing. The drought was bad, yes, but his crops were in the middle of their growth cycle. This wasn't just bad timing, it was a disaster. "But my harvest, my livelihood. This is my entire season. Without water, everything will die." "I understand, but there's nothing I can do. You'll have to talk to the council." Tom hung up, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on him. He stood there, staring at the dry earth beneath his feet. He'd worked his whole life for this farm, for these fields, and now they were slowly dying in front of him. It wasn't just a bad day, it was a turning point, and with every minute that passed, his harvest slipped further out of reach. The heat of the afternoon sun was unbearable, but Tom couldn't leave. He had no choice but to stand there in the middle of his drying fields, his mind racing. The phone call from the city office replayed in his head. The decision to cut off his water was final, and there was nothing he could do to change it. He felt trapped. His heart beat fast as he thought about the months of hard work that were now at risk, all because of some city decision that didn't consider the struggles of the farmers. Tom's mind kept going back to the same question. How could they just take the water away like this? He'd had tried everything he could to reach someone higher up, but every call led him to more bureaucratic walls. City officials didn't care about the fields, the crops, or the hard work that had been put into them. They only cared about the city's water supply. For them, a farmer's crop was nothing more than a number on a report. The next day, Tom decided to go to City Hall. He knew it was a long shot, but he had to try. Maybe if he explained the situation face to face, they would understand. So he grabbed his jacket, wiped his hands on his jeans, and drove to the small downtown area where City Hall stood. Inside, the building was cool, a stark contrast to the heat outside. The walls were lined with gray carpet and long, empty hallways. Tom walked to the reception desk, his boots clicking loudly on the tile. The receptionist, a young woman with tired eyes, barely looked up as he approached. "I need to speak with someone about the water issue," Tom said, trying to keep his voice steady. The receptionist sighed and pointed toward the far end of the room. "You can speak to Mr. Sloan, but he's busy. You'll have to wait." Tom nodded and took a seat in the waiting area. He had been to City Hall before, but this time it felt different. He was fighting for his future. And it wasn't just about the water. It was about his farm, his family, his way of life. He watched the clock tick slowly as time dragged on. An hour passed, then another. Finally, a door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, dressed in a suit, with a tight expression on his face. "Mr. Grayson, I presume," the man said, looking at him like he was just another problem to deal with. "Yes, sir," Tom replied, standing up. "I came here because you cut off the water to my fields. You don't understand. The crops are dying. Without the water, I'll lose everything." Mr. Sloan didn't seem moved. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the papers in front of him. "We've made the decision, Mr. Grayson. The city needs the water more than the farms right now. We're in a drought. It's out of my hands." Tom's frustration boiled over. "But this is my family's land, my crops. I can't just sit back and watch it all die because of some decision made in a meeting room." Sloan remained calm, his tone indifferent. "I'm sorry for your situation, but there's nothing we can do. The decision is final." Tom's heart sank. He had been hoping for a change, but it seemed like no one was listening. He turned to leave, feeling helpless. As he stepped out of the building, the weight of the world pressed even harder on his shoulders. The city had made its choice. Now all he had left to do was watch his crops wither away. It was early morning when Tom returned to his fields, the sky still holding on to a faint glow of dawn. He stood at the edge of the land, looking at the dry soil beneath him. His wheat, which should have been standing tall and strong, was now beginning to droop. The leaves curled up, the golden stalks sagging under the weight of the heat. The once green rows were slowly turning yellow, then brown. With each passing hour, the damage was getting worse. The water, the life source for his crops, had been cut off, and Tom was running out of time. He walked slowly through the fields, touching the dry earth, hoping for some kind of miracle. The cracks in the soil seemed to grow deeper with every step. His thoughts raced. What could he do? How could he save the farm? His father had worked this land, and his grandfather before him. Tom had always dreamed of passing it down to his children. But now, that dream was slipping away, piece by piece, like the dry soil slipping through his fingers. As he moved through the fields, he spotted some of his neighbors. The other farmers were in the same boat, frantic, pacing back and forth, trying to figure out what to do. They had all heard about the city's decision, but nobody knew how to fight it. They'd all been relying on the city's water, just like Tom. Without it, their crops were as good as gone. Tom's mind kept coming back to the same thought. There has to be a way. He couldn't just stand by and watch everything he had worked for disappear. He grabbed a hose from the side of his barn and began to drag it toward the closest field, praying that it would be enough to water at least a small patch of land. But he knew, deep down, it wasn't going to work. He couldn't cover his whole farm with a few hoses, and without the city's supply, there was no chance of saving the harvest. As he walked along the fields, trying to do what he could with a watering can and the small amount of water he had left, the weight of it all seemed to settle deeper into his chest. He couldn't do this alone. He had no more resources, no more options. The thought of losing his farm, of seeing his family's legacy wither away, was almost too much to bear. He stopped for a moment, sitting down on a bale of hay in the shade of a nearby barn. His hands were covered in dirt, his face streaked with sweat. It was a feeling he hadn't had in years, helplessness. He had fought to build his farm, to keep it going for generations. But now, with the city turning its back on him, he didn't know what to do next. He could hear the sound of distant voices as the other farmers gathered at the edge of town, all of them struggling with the same impossible situation. They were all thinking the same thing, asking the same questions, but none of them had answers. It was as if the world had turned its back on them all at once. Tom stood up, wiping his brow. There has to be something, he thought again. Someone will listen. Someone will help. The next morning, as Tom stood in his fields, watching the last of his crops wilt under the sun, a strange noise reached his ears. It was a low, powerful hum, growing louder as the minutes passed. Tom paused, squinting against the bright light, trying to figure out what it was. The sound cut through the quiet of the morning, unlike anything he had ever heard on his farm. At first, he thought it might be a plane passing overhead, but the noise didn't fade. Instead, it grew louder, more insistent. He looked up, shielding his eyes from the harsh sunlight, and saw it, a helicopter, its blades slicing through the air with a deep roar. It was heading straight for his farm. Tom's heart skipped a beat. Who could this be? He wondered, his mind racing. What's going on? The helicopter came closer, flying low over the fields, kicking up dust as it approached. He stood frozen for a moment, unsure what to do. The helicopter hovered for a moment, then began to descend, its large shadow stretching across the ground as it landed in the center of his land, just a few feet from his drying crops. As the helicopter touched down, the blade slowly spun to a stop, leaving the air thick with dust and the faint smell of oil. The door of the helicopter opened, and out stepped a tall man in military uniform. His face was set in a stern expression, and he moved with purpose, his boots kicking up dirt with every step. He was no ordinary man, and Tom could tell immediately. The man's presence was commanding. He didn't look like someone from the city or someone who had come to cause trouble. There was something different about him, something that told Tom this wasn't just an ordinary visit. The man walked up to Tom, who was still standing in the middle of this field, barely able to process what was happening. The stranger's sharp eyes scanned the land, taking in the withered crops and the dusty earth. It was clear that he understood the situation without a word being spoken. His expression softened just slightly, as if he had seen this kind of struggle before. "Are you Mr. Grayson?" the man asked, his voice deep and steady. "Yes," Tom replied, his voice hoarse from the heat and exhaustion. "Who are you?" The man paused for a moment, sizing up Tom before answering. "General Antonio Smith. I'm with the Marines." Tom blinked, caught off guard. "A Marine? Here?" he thought, confused. "Why are you here?" he asked, still not sure what to make of this unexpected visitor. General Smith gave him a small nod, his eyes narrowing slightly as he surveyed the parched fields. "I've been briefed on your situation. I've come to help." Tom felt a surge of hope rise in him, a feeling he hadn't had for days. "Help? How?" "I'm not here to play politics," General Smith said firmly. "I'm here because your farm matters, your crops matter, and we're going to find a way to fix this." Tom stared at the general for a moment, still trying to process what was happening. This man, a high-ranking military officer, had just shown up in the middle of his dying field, offering help without hesitation. For the first time in days, Tom felt a small spark of hope. "We got work to do," General Smith said, his tone decisive. "Let's get started." General Smith didn't waste any time. As soon as he stepped off the helicopter, he started organizing his team. A small group of military engineers followed him, all carrying heavy bags filled with equipment. They moved quickly, their steps coordinated like they'd done this sort of thing many times before. "We're going to need to set up a temporary irrigation system," the general explained to Tom, his voice steady as he pointed to the far side of the field. "We'll pull water from the reserve tanks nearby and rig up a network of pipes to get it to your crops." Tom stood there stunned. He had spent the last few days trying to figure out how to save his farm, but he had no idea where to even start. Now here was a team of soldiers led by a Marine general offering a real solution. It felt like a dream. "But the water reserve?" Tom asked, still trying to understand. "Isn't that for the city?" "Normally, yes," General Smith nodded, "but we've got access to enough to help out in emergencies. This qualifies." Tom looked around. His fields were huge. How would they possibly get water to every part of them in time? But the general seemed confident, and his team was already setting to work, unloading pipes, pumps, and other tools. It was clear that this was more than just a quick fix. They were here to make sure Tom's crops had a fighting chance. Within minutes, the engineers had set up a small base near the edge of the field. They'd started connecting pipes to the nearby water reserves, working with a precision that surprised Tom. It was nothing like the slow, frustrating process of dealing with city officials. The soldiers didn't ask for permission or wait for approval. They just acted. They had a mission, and they were going to complete it, no matter what. "I've seen this kind of thing before," General Smith said, glancing at Tom as he worked alongside his team. "When you're in the military, you learn that sometimes you have to find solutions in the most unexpected places. We're here to make sure your farm doesn't become another casualty of a broken system." Tom couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. Here was a man who had no obligation to help, yet he was doing everything he could to save not just Tom's farm, but the entire community's food supply. It wasn't just about crops. It was about people's lives, their livelihoods. General Smith knew that. Hours passed as the team worked. The air was thick with dust, and the sound of machines working filled the silence of the fields. Tom did everything he could to help, though he knew he wasn't as skilled as the military engineers. He fetched tools, handed them pipes, and watched in awe as they built a makeshift irrigation system in what seemed like no time at all. By the time the sun began to set, the pipes were in place. Water began to flow from the reserve, slowly trickling into the irrigation channels that snaked through the fields. It was a small stream at first, but it was enough to start the process. The crops, already wilting, slowly began to soak up the much-needed water. It wasn't a miracle, but it was the closest thing to one that Tom had seen in days. "This will hold for now," General Smith said as he wiped his brow. "You got time to finish your harvest. You'll make it through." Tom looked at the water flowing into his fields, and for the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of hope. They weren't out of the woods yet, but with the general's help, he had a chance to save his farm. And that chance was all he needed. The sound of water flowing through the pipes was a welcome noise. After days of desperation, Tom could finally hear the life-saving water spreading across his fields. It wasn't enough to undo the damage already done, but it was a start, a lifeline. General Smith stood beside him, watching as the water began to reach the crops. His team worked quickly, adjusting the flow and ensuring the water spread evenly across the land. "We've got a solid system in place," the general said, his tone calm but serious. "This will buy you time, but you need to keep working fast. We don't know how long this reserve will last, and we can't rely on it forever." Tom nodded, his mind already racing. "How much time do I really have?" "The crops will drink up the water quickly," General Smith explained. "But the longer you wait, the less chance you have. Once the water gets to the roots, it'll help them recover. But you need to keep pushing. Harvest everything you can as fast as possible." Tom glanced over at the fields, where the crops were beginning to perk up just slightly, the yellowing turning into green in places. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to fuel a small spark of hope. He hadn't given up yet, and neither had General Smith. "We can help with the harvest too," the general added. "We've got some heavy machinery on standby. It'll speed things up." Tom looked at the general, surprised. He had thought that was the end of the help, that the soldiers would simply leave once the water was flowing. But now here was a man who was ready to do whatever it took to make sure his crops didn't die. "That's more than I could have ever asked for," Tom said, his voice thick with emotion. He tried to keep it together, but the weight of it all was starting to hit him. A military general, a group of soldiers, and a few hours of hard work had given him the chance to save everything he had worked for. "Maybe I can still pull this off," he thought, looking at the land that had been his family's for generations. The next few hours flew by. The soldiers worked with precision, setting up additional irrigation pipes in the fields that had been hardest hit by the drought. They checked the water flow, making adjustments, and worked alongside Tom and his neighbors. Together, they moved quickly, knowing that every minute counted. The heavy machinery that General Smith had promised arrived shortly after, and with it, the work sped up even more. The combines and harvesters made quick work of the crops, gathering them into large containers that would be sent for processing. Tom watched as the machines roared to life, moving through the fields with military efficiency. He couldn't believe how quickly everything was coming together. The general's team was relentless, and the extra hands made all the difference. The first few bins of wheat were already rolling in, and Tom couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. They might just make it after all. As the day wore on, the sun sank lower in the sky. The crops that had been barely hanging on were now being harvested, thanks to the quick action of General Smith and his team. Tom looked around at the workers, his heart swelling with gratitude. In a world that often seemed out of his control, this was a reminder that sometimes help came from the most unexpected places, and sometimes it was exactly what you needed to survive. As the last light of day faded behind the hills, Tom stood at the edge of his farm, watching the harvesters collect the final rows of wheat. The fields, once on the brink of disaster, were now looking better than he could have hoped just a few days ago. General Smith and his team had made the impossible possible. Thanks to their help, Tom had salvaged what he could, but now a new challenge loomed. What would the city do? The water that had been redirected was still flowing, but Tom knew it wouldn't last forever. The officials hadn't made any promises, and the reserves would eventually run dry. He couldn't afford to wait and hope for the best. Something had to change, and soon. Early the next morning, Tom got in his truck and drove to City Hall. He knew he couldn't fight this alone anymore. General Smith had given him the means to survive, but that didn't mean the problem was solved. The city needed to step up, not just for him, but for all the farmers who depended on the water to survive. As he parked outside City Hall, he saw the familiar faces of other farmers milling around the front steps. They looked just as determined as he felt. "We've got to do something about this," one of them said, her face drawn tight with worry. "We can't lose another year's harvest." "We can't keep letting them make decisions for us," another added. "We have to be heard." Tom nodded. He knew this fight was bigger than just his farm now. It was about the future of agriculture in their community. It was about the survival of people's livelihoods, families, and the land that had supported them for generations. They weren't going to let the city's decisions decide their fate without a fight. Together, they entered City Hall, the same building where Tom had felt so powerless just days ago. Now, with a sense of unity and resolve, they were ready to make their voices heard. The receptionist at the desk didn't seem surprised to see them. The same tired look in her eyes told Tom that they had seen this kind of thing before. Still, he wasn't about to back down now. "We need to speak with someone in charge," Tom said, his voice firm. "It's time to fix this." Soon enough, they were escorted to a small meeting room. The door opened, and in walked a familiar face, the same city official who had told Tom his water was cut off in the first place. Mr. Sloan. He looked just as unbothered as before, but this time something in his posture was different. Maybe it was the presence of all the farmers standing in front of him, or maybe it was the sense of urgency in the air. But Tom could feel it. This time, things wouldn't be so easy for the city. "Mr. Sloan," Tom began, his voice calm but determined, "this situation isn't over. We've had enough. The water can't just be taken from us like that. The crops are our livelihoods." Sloan looked at them, his expression unchanged. "I understand your frustration, but the city is in a crisis. The resources are limited, and the decisions have already been made. You can't just ignore us," Tom said, stepping forward. "We're part of this city too, and you have a responsibility to us." The room was silent for a moment as Sloan looked at each farmer in turn. Then slowly he sighed. "I don't have all the answers," Sloan admitted, "but maybe it's time we revisit how these decisions are made. We can't let the drought take everyone down with it." Tom felt a flicker of hope. This wasn't over, but at least the city was starting to listen. For the first time in days, he felt like they might just have a chance. It was a week later when the first signs of change appeared. After their meeting at City Hall, Tom and the other farmers had fought hard to make their case. It wasn't easy. There were heated discussions, long hours of waiting, and plenty of frustration. But something had shifted. The city officials had started to realize the gravity of the situation. They couldn't ignore the farmers any longer. The public pressure, along with the undeniable truth of the drought's impact, forced them to reconsider their approach. A new plan had been drawn up, one that would ensure water was distributed more fairly, taking into account the needs of both the city and the surrounding farms. There would be better water management and an emergency reserve set aside for critical situations like the one Tom had faced. The change wasn't perfect, but it was a step forward, a small victory in a much larger battle. Tom stood at the edge of his farm again, looking out at the fields that were slowly recovering. The crops were still yellowed in places, but the water was doing its job. Thanks to General Smith's team and the support of the farmers, they had been able to save what was left of the harvest. The city had finally agreed to provide a more reliable water source for the farmers, which meant that next season, things could go back to normal. As he walked through the fields, Tom's thoughts wandered to the past few weeks. Everything had seemed so bleak. When the city cut off the water, it felt like the end of everything he had worked for. But now, looking at his fields, he realized that sometimes the hardest moments in life can spark change. If the drought had never happened, if the city hadn't made that tough decision, the farmers may never have come together like they had. They might never have fought for what they needed to survive. Now there was a sense of unity in the air that hadn't been there before. General Smith had left shortly after the irrigation system was set up, but Tom had kept in touch. The general had promised to stay involved, ensuring that any future issues would be handled differently. For now, though, it was time for the farm to focus on the future. Tom felt a sense of calm that had been absent for weeks. The fight wasn't over, but the worst of it was. He took a deep breath and looked around. The fields were alive again, slowly but surely. The crops were growing, the sky was clear, and the sun was starting to warm the earth in the way it should. Life was returning to normal bit by bit. As he headed back to the barn, he saw his neighbors walking toward him, all smiles and relief. They were all feeling the same sense of hope. Together, they had faced something no one had expected. Together, they had saved what was worth saving. "How's it looking?" one of his neighbors called out, a grin on her face. "It's coming back," Tom replied, his voice steady and full of optimism. "We got a fighting chance, thanks to all of us." They nodded, knowing that the real victory wasn't just in the water or the harvest, it was in the way they had all come together when it mattered most. As Tom looked out at his fields, he knew one thing for sure. Sometimes the hardest battles bring out the strongest bonds. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like he could face whatever came next.